Well, I'm very excited to be introducing Tom Solomon. I heard him a few weeks ago and the presentation is fantastic. It was clear, science-based, lots of information. So I think we're going to learn a lot tonight. And just to briefly tell you something about him, after working 34 years at Intel, he retired and has committed his life really to activism on this issue and of climate concern and salvation. He is now the co-coordinator of 350 New Mexico, which is fighting global warming to ensure a safe world for our children, a safe climate for all of us. Let me say just some of the things that 350 New Mexico does. Some of their campaigns include new UNM's divestment, large public gatherings to demand action on climate, education forums on the need to rapidly convert from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Tom was part of helping pass climate legislation, including the 2019 Energy Transition Act, which expanded New Mexico's renewable electricity standard to 100% carbon-free by 2045. So we're lucky to have him. We're going to learn a lot. I will ask you all, there will be time for questions, and I've been on a presentation with him before, and he's great about answering the questions. So if you would wait, put your questions in the chat, and then we can all see what they are, and Tom will get to them and answer them in order. So pay attention to that. Put your questions in the chat, and let's let Tom begin. Thank you, Tom, for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much. My name is Tom Solomon, and as was said, I am co-coordinator of 350 New Mexico, a group dedicated to climate action and fighting the fossil fuel industry. What I'm going to talk to you about tonight is blue hydrogen, and I'll explain why it has that color. Here we go. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started and go right into it. So this is a blue hydrogen briefing. I've presented it well over a dozen times now, starting really last October. It's got November 2021 in quotes because I keep updating it as time goes on and the ground that we're fighting on shifts. And I put this little iconic photograph of the Hindenburg hydrogen airship exploding in 1937 as a caution against what is trying to be pushed on us, which is to use hydrogen very inappropriately. And we'll go through all of that as we go through the slides. In general, the answer for nearly all of the applications that we're being told is ripe for hydrogen is really just to use clean electricity directly from solar and wind, and we'll talk about that. I have kind of encapsulated the key takeaways from tonight's presentation here, and I'll put on the chat a little bit later a link to where you can find these slides on the web, so you'll be actually able to get to the slide deck and launch some of those hyperlinks like the one on the top. Good hydrogen fact sheet put together by Sierra Club and some others with our help. So you can refer to that. And here's the key messages. So blue hydrogen, which is really kind of hydrogen made from methane or fossil fuels. It is a fossil fuel program and it's being pushed because of that. Subsidizing the production of hydrogen from methane are really subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, which we need to scale back on and not add more of. The total carbon footprint, meaning all the global warming gases that are emitted to the atmosphere as a result of producing hydrogen in this way, is really literally 20% worse than just if you were to take natural gas and burn it directly. And I'll show you why that is. And I'm going to take you through two scientific studies, well vetted, that prove that. Hydrogen is it's not a fuel, it's not a naturally occurring fuel, it's what they call an energy carrier, kind of like electricity is an energy carrier, and as such it is very wasteful. It is more than twice as bad as an energy carrier versus electricity. because of very inefficient losses that you'll see. Electricity from hydrogen is so much more costly than wind and solar electricity that it's really unprofitable, according to the people building one of these hydrogen electric plants. What we should be pursuing instead of this focus on hydrogen is the real solution to the climate crisis, which is to urgently and massively build the renewable energy that will allow us to replace coal-fired and gas-fired power plants on the electric grid, and then use all of that clean electricity to electrify transportation and most other ways in which we use fossil fuels in our life. And pushing hydrogen is a distraction from that, which is job one. The current and fourth incarnation of a Hydrogen Hub Development Act is called House Bill 228. It is being heard as we speak in a committee on the legislature, and it would allow major carbon dioxide emissions. It would, give state money and benefits to producing what is disingenuously called clean hydrogen, which actually produces 2 kilograms of carbon dioxide for every kilogram of hydrogen that you produce. So it's 2-to-1 emissions versus what you get for hydrogen. It is not clean. It's as clean as clean coal. And going in this direction will increase New Mexico's carbon footprint for those and many other reasons why we oppose it. So here's why. There is this stuff called, it's kind of got a term now, hydrogen hype. So hydrogen is all the rage in the press and in industry and magazines and in government circles and in the Sandia labs, unfortunately. And it's really at its root, it's being pushed by the fossil fuel industry and by oil, gas, and pipeline companies. It is not being pushed by the environmental community at all. We stand really firmly against it. And this is one example of a very good report warning of the dangers of the hydrogen hype. This is one from Earth Justice, and at that link you can read it. It started, this hype started really, I think you can trace it back to about 2017, when this consortium of companies led by the fossil fuel industry was started in Europe, and Britain is the kind of the epicenter of this across the ocean, and it's called the European Union Hydrogen Council. And what I did is I just copied their logo page from their website and I put it there at the bottom, and then I circled all of the oil and gas companies in red, and so you can see it's just littered with them. And so they are companies like British Petroleum and Shell and Chevron and Saudi Aramco and Sinopec and Baker Hughes and Southern Cal Gas and on and on and on, major fossil fuel companies. And the reason they're pushing this is because converting to hydrogen provides them a path to sell more natural gas or methane and to delay the clean energy transition. And most recently, like the last few days, there was a story that came out that identified this PR firm called FTI Consulting as an oil and gas industry PR firm that is sending out most of this hydrogen hype into the press, and that's what they do. And so, it is the fossil fuel industry is behind this because they are worried, quite frankly, about the clean energy transition, which has the prospect of dramatically cutting the market for their products, which is oil and gas and diesel and coal, all of that, which has to go away in a clean energy future that we can survive, and they're fighting it. So what is hydrogen? Hydrogen is the smallest element in the universe. It has a single proton, and I'm pointing that out because as an element with one proton, it is extremely reactive with other atoms. And so you basically hardly ever find it in nature by itself. It is always found in combination with other atoms like oxygen to make H2O, which is water, or with carbon to make various hydrocarbons, the most simple of which is methane or CH4. And if you want to pry off the hydrogen from either one of those molecules, you got to invest a lot of energy in terms of either electricity or heat or temperature. and to separate hydrogen from those other atoms. And that's why we call it an energy carrier, because it doesn't occur in nature as a fuel. You got to create molecular hydrogen, and then you got to carry it somewhere to use the work you put into it. In the footer, I just made a note that if you want to create a kilogram of green hydrogen, which I'll explain, it takes about 50 kilowatt hours of electricity to do that. So that's the energy input required. Where is hydrogen used today? About 55% of it, the lion's share, goes into ammonia production, mostly to make ammonia-based fertilizers. The second largest slice is in the petroleum refining industry and refineries. A lot of it to purify diesel fuel. And the next biggest slice is for methanol production. And then there is another miscellaneous 10% that goes to various other smaller uses. So the lion's share is basically to produce ammonia for fertilizer, and then petroleum refining for all of the uses of petroleum in our lives. And then I'm going to explain how it is that hydrogen is created from these various other sources. And so this is a chart that one of the industry groups put out. I am going to simplify it by just focusing on these left three kinds, which is really the lion's share of what we're talking about. And so you can produce hydrogen from water. You can produce hydrogen from methane or natural gas, right? So H2O or CH4. First, we'll talk about producing it from water. So you take electricity, ideally it's from some renewable source, not nuclear power, but some consider that clean enough to use, call it green hydrogen. And then you take that electricity and you run it through water in what's called an electrolytic cell. And off of one electrode bubbles hydrogen, off the other bubbles oxygen, and you capture the hydrogen. And then you've got green hydrogen. It's all the same kind of hydrogen. It's just a color that they name it because that identifies where it came from. So green hydrogen doesn't emit any carbon dioxide, no fossil fuel emissions here. But that is a tiny, tiny fraction, way less than 1% of all hydrogen produced. About 98% of all hydrogen produced comes from methane or natural gas, a tiny bit from coal. Let's just concentrate on the methane. So you take natural gas, which is 90% methane, and then you run it through a process called steam methane reforming, which is this big industrial operation and kind of looks like that. And you take, water, flash it into steam, put it under high pressure, heat it up even higher temperature, and then you crack the methane and separate hydrogen from the carbon, but that carbon then combines with the oxygen in that process, and it comes off as carbon dioxide, which is the main global warming gas that's warming the planet, CO2 here. And it's actually at a ratio of somewhere between 7 and 9 to 1 hydrogen to CO2. And through this process of steam methane reforming, you get what's called gray hydrogen. And so the vast majority, like 98% of all hydrogen produced in the world today, is this very dirty gray hydrogen with lots and lots of CO2 emissions. If, however, you make an attempt to capture some of that carbon dioxide, so it doesn't all go into the atmosphere, then you do what's called carbon capture and storage. And then they give it this much friendlier color called blue hydrogen. So steam methane reforming with some carbon capture and try to pump that CO2 underground, then you've got blue hydrogen. So the three colors. It is a fact, however, that 98% of worldwide demand for hydrogen really comes from fossil fuels. There's about 76.5 million metric tons, at least in 2019. And only 1/4% or 0.2 of a metric ton was this green hydrogen. So it's a tiny, tiny fraction, right? As I said, it's almost all this kind. But there's enough green hydrogen produced that they can distract us all and say, oh, it's a green solution because look, there's this way to make hydrogen from water with no carbon emissions. But in fact, it's almost all gray hydrogen, and producing gray hydrogen accounts for about 2.3% of all global carbon dioxide emissions. which come from producing hydrogen. Okay, so you got electrolysis from water or steam methane reforming from natural gas, which is a major source of CO2 emissions. This chart is from a European group called the Transport and Environment. And again, I'm going to cover part of it to just focus on the two columns on the left. And it is used to show you how inefficient hydrogen is as an energy carrier versus the alternative of using just direct electrification. And in this example, it is for an electric car. So if you want to use electricity or hydrogen to power an electric car, you either go through this path or this path. And each one of these steps shows you where there are losses for the electricity that you started with versus what you end up with at the bottom to power the wheels of the vehicle. And I should note that a fuel cell vehicle powered by hydrogen is ultimately an electric car. It's run by an electric motor. It's just powered by a tank of hydrogen to run that electric motor, and I'll explain why that is. So let's start with, if you just got an electric car, so you start with ideally 100% renewable electricity, if you could, and then you lose about 6% of it just transporting that electricity over the wires and through the distribution network to your car. And then you've got the charging equipment and the battery losses, and then you've got to convert the electric current from AC to DC or DC to AC, depending, and then you've got the electric motor. Each one of these steps, you lose about 5% each, 4% here. You multiply all of these together, and from all the electricity you started with, you're actually going to get 77% of it to power the electric car at the wheels, and that's pretty good. That is quite efficient as things go. The other example, however, is for a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, excuse me. And in that case, you've got a bunch of other steps that you have to go through that impose a lot of losses. And it's basically, energy going off in heat. So the first lossy step is the electrolysis itself. So running electricity through water to create hydrogen. It's only about 76% efficient. Then you've got to transport the hydrogen, in a truck or a pipeline or whatever and distribute it. That's only about 89% efficient. And then you've got to take that hydrogen in the tank in your fuel cell car, and then you've got to run it through a fuel cell which converts hydrogen back to electricity inside the car. That is only 54% efficient. And then you've got the same two steps at the bottom here for the electric motor, and you end up multiplying all that together and you have 33% efficiency. So using hydrogen as your carrier for electricity in this example, it wastes a lot of electricity, and it's about 2.3 times worse if you take the ratio of 77 to 33. So that's why we say hydrogen as an energy carrier is very wasteful, 2.3 times worse than electricity, because of all of these lossy steps, the worst one being the fuel cell and the second worst one being just the electrolysis itself, okay? So this fact of the inefficiency of using hydrogen and all the losses that it has to undergo influences the economics of using hydrogen in many, many applications, just because it's so wasteful, especially when it's competing against electricity. So it's going to lose in the marketplace for economics in most applications because of this. So this slide is the hydrogen Swiss Army knife. I get a kick out of it every time I see it. It is an example of what are all of the various use cases that industry is trying to convince us that hydrogen could be used for. And they've got the places where it's being used today, like as a chemical feedstock and desulfurization and fertilizer. That's gray hydrogen today, but they want to use it for short haul aviation and other kinds of aviation, and in ships and in regional trucks and trains, and in commercial heating and in power system rebalancing and long-term storage. All of that stuff And each one of these is theoretically possible as an application for hydrogen if you didn't care about how inefficient it was, and if you didn't have to compete against electricity, which is a far better answer. So just like you could build a house with a Swiss Army knife if you were foolish enough to try to use the little saw to cut your wood and the little screwdriver to put in all the screws. Instead, you would use an electric saw, right, an electric screwdriver, and a power hammer, and all the things that you would really use to build the house. And so that's kind of the analogy that this is for. If you take all of these various use cases that are all jumbled up and you put some order to them, you end up with this slide. So this is those various possible applications of using hydrogen, rank ordered from top to bottom and given a grade from A to F or G based on how economically efficient they are versus the competition that they will face. And at the top level, given a grade of A, is where gray hydrogen is used in industry today. And remember that earlier slide with the pie chart that says, well, gray hydrogen is used to produce fertilizer, ammonia for fertilizer, and then in petrochemical refining, which is these hydrogenation and hydrocracking and desulfurization steps, and then there's methanol. That's where we use gray hydrogen today. But what industry is trying to convince us of is to expand the market for hydrogen, especially produced from natural gas, and use it for all of these other things, which get worse and worse grades, and they had to create a new grade called G, completely uncompetitive. And so they are intending to expand the use of hydrogen gas so that they can sell us more natural gas, which is their product and is causing a lot of global warming, and that's fracking, and it causes many health effects, and it really damages the health of frontline communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what is at the root of what's happening here. Let me show you now what a very specific example is in New Mexico of where they're attempting to build a hydrogen project, and it's called the Escalante Hydrogen Conversion Project. The Escalante power plant is a photograph here. It is a power plant in Pruitt, New Mexico, about 100 miles west of Albuquerque. And it was a coal-fired power plant, 40 years old now, closed down in 2020 because producing electricity from coal is no longer competitive. Used to employ about 107 people in this coal-fired power plant. And as a smallish power plant, 253 megawatts, whose electricity was sold to the rural electric co-ops by Tri-State Generation, if you're familiar with the electricity market in New Mexico. So that's what they used to use it for. It is now shuttered. And what they want to do is to take this now closed coal-fired power plant and spend what was last July listed as about $425 million, but whose price tag is now ballooned to $600 million in the latest reporting, and use that $600 million to convert this 40-year-old coal-fired power plant to produce hydrogen from natural gas, and then to combust that hydrogen to heat up the steam that runs the generator that produces electricity in a power plant. And they want to get it up and running by 2025, and they say they will create 110 jobs. So that's their plan, to take this old coal plant, convert it to a hydrogen facility, and run it off of hydrogen. Well, to do that, you can't just use the coal plant like it was and just burn hydrogen. You got to do a bunch of other stuff first, which is very expensive and costly and time consuming. So they have to build an air separation unit. An air separation unit is a way of using electricity to cryogenically freeze atmospheric air and then to convert it into its main components, which are nitrogen, oxygen, and argon. That's what goes into these tanks. So they got to build one of those and power it. They got to build that steam methane reformer unit that I talked to you about, which will use some of this oxygen and the natural gas that comes off of a pipeline that's actually real nearby, a natural gas pipeline. And then they got to do steam methane reforming. And then the carbon dioxide that comes off of that process, they have to capture and sequester. So they have to build a third industrial operation, which I don't have a photo of, which will be the carbon dioxide sequestration unit. And powering all of this extra stuff off the electricity from that plant provides major parasitic loads off the output that could have gone to the grid. And according to Wiley Rhodes, the CEO of Escalante Hydrogen Power, in the technical review that I attended last July, he told me that they do not expect this to be profitable in terms of selling electricity. So they're investing all of this money to build the power plant to produce hydrogen that will not be able to sell electricity at a profit. Go figure. And because it cuts the output of the plant from 253 megawatts to maybe 164 megawatts. So a lot less electricity because they got to power this other stuff. What else do they plan to do with the hydrogen? Well, they plan to possibly inject about 5% of it and back into the gas pipeline that they tap the natural gas off in the first place. Forgive me for using methane and natural gas interchangeably because they're about the same thing. And to make something that they call green cement, which is a foolish prospect. They plan to use the hydrogen, I think, to provide the heat to decalcinate the calcium carbonate that goes into making cement out in the middle of, nowhere in New Mexico, 100 miles from any major city. So that's their plan. Off of their website, you can see this flow chart that kind of shows in blue boxes what they plan to do. And that's the steam methane reforming step, and that's the air separation unit. And then I put these little black lines off of their output because they're going to have to tap off the output to power these things, plus the carbon capture and sequestration unit. So that's what they do. This is a slide showing the notes that I took in the technical review from last July, and you can go back and read it if you like. I've kind of covered it in the previous slide, but there's a little bit more detail here if you want to go back and look at it. If you're interested in the chemistry of what goes on with a steam methane reforming process and how the air separation unit operates, that's what this slide is for. But I'm going to go on to talking about the money. So, follow the money. The money to, provide up to $600 million to do this conversion, we believe is coming from a company called Tallgrass Energy. This is a press release from their website. Tallgrass Energy acquires a 75% membership interest in Escalante Hydrogen Power, and here it is. So who is Tallgrass Energy? They are an owner and operator of more than 8,300 miles of natural gas pipeline, along with some miles of crude pipeline. And this is, their network of pipelines from their website. And so, they didn't ask me, but my very informed speculation is that their purpose is to make sure that there is an ongoing customer and market for their main product, which is natural gas in their pipelines, as we go through this clean energy transition, which should, in a sane climate future, mean that they don't have a market for natural gas anymore, because we've got to keep that stuff in the ground and stop burning it if we want to have a safe climate. But nope, they want to make sure that they can sell it to us in the form of hydrogen. So that's their purpose. They will also likely use something in the federal tax code called the 45Q tax credit. The 45Q tax credit provides up to $50 per ton to industrial operations that take carbon dioxide that they produce and sequester it underground. And so they're going to make a market for more natural gas, burn it for the purposes of creating something that they can then tell the federal government that they're going to sequester. And I think that they should have just kept it in the ground in the first place, but that's their plan. So that is the Escalante Hydrogen Project, the first of two major hydrogen projects in New Mexico that I'm going to talk about. And this is the second one. It's called Bayotech. Biotech is a spin-off of Sandia Labs, uses some of their innovations in steam methane reforming technology, and they produce these things called mobile hydrogen hubs. That's a picture of one of them. This information is right off of their website. And so they produce gray hydrogen from natural gas or methane. And they call them hydrogen hubs, and they emit lots and lots of carbon dioxide because it's gray hydrogen. Their website, which has got a screen clipping right here, shows that in their process, they emit 9,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide for every 1,000 kilograms of hydrogen they produce. So it's a 9-to-1 ratio of CO2 global warming emissions for every bit of hydrogen. And right here's the box showing how much hydrogen they produce, and here's the box showing how much carbon dioxide they emit. And they also produce NOx emissions, which are actually very unhealthy and a component of smog. So that's Biotech. It seems from their marketing materials and listening to them speak that one of their plans is to sell people these modular hydrogen hubs, and they put them next to like interstate highways as a way to produce hydrogen for transportation fuel. So they will set up fueling stations for hydrogen for fuel cell vehicles, fuel cell trucks across the nation, to try to convince us that hydrogen is a good idea to use for transportation, which it is not. That's Biotech. Now let's look at the science. So there have been, as I said, 2 major scientific papers published that show what the real problem is with producing this blue hydrogen from methane. And this is the first and most important one, published last August by Howarth and Jacobson out of Cornell and Stanford universities. And they did a very, very intensive analysis of the full life cycle emissions of generating hydrogen from natural gas. And to spare you reading the whole abstract, this is the pull quote that really talks about their conclusion. To call it a zero emissions fuel is totally wrong. What we found that it's not even a low emissions fuel either, because the greenhouse gas footprint of blue hydrogen was more than 20% greater than just burning natural gas or coal for heat. So if you skip this whole step of making blue hydrogen, if you just directly in a gas-fired power plant or wherever, just directly burn natural gas, you end up with a better answer for the climate, a 20% better answer. That's the science, and it's unimpeachable. It has never been refuted. There are no scientific papers that pick apart their conclusions because they are rock solid. And they made some very basic assumptions that about 3.5% of all methane leaks upstream, because it does from fracking and all the pipelines that transport it. This is very solidly sourced with lots of studies that show that's about the national average of leakage from upstream methane. They used a pretty generous assumption of 85% carbon capture during that steam methane reforming process. And they also added that they would try to capture some of the gases from the electricity generating plant that provides the electricity to produce the electricity to run the steam methane reforming equipment. So why is all of that? How do these life cycle emissions play out, and where are their contributions? So I took the data from their paper and made this pie chart. This is right from their paper. And so 63% of all of the life cycle emissions that cause, this major footprint for blue hydrogen come from fugitive methane upstream. And the reason why that's such a big factor is because methane, as a global warming gas, is about 85 times more potent molecule per molecule than is carbon dioxide. So, 3.5% leakage of methane times all the methane that you consume in steam methane reforming generates an enormous footprint of global warming. The next largest slice is the amount of carbon dioxide put off by generating the power to run the steam methane reformer. And then you've got some other slices related to, not capturing all of that CO2 in complete carbon capture. And then 6% from the power that it took to run the carbon capture equipment. And then there's some upstream miscellaneous CO2 emissions as well. So you're not getting anything for free here. All of the electricity that you're generating, unless you're in 100% renewable energy future, is generating CO2 emissions. And so if you're going to use electricity to run this process, you've got to deal with the fact, forgive me, that you got all these emissions. Let me scroll back to that slide. And get back to where we were. So that's the full life cycle emissions picture for blue hydrogen. And there was some pretty good press, including the story in the New York Times when it came out. So I want to highlight one more bullet from that story, which is that when they did all of their modeling, they did a corner case looking at a much lower level of methane emissions, fugitive methane upstream. Remember, I said it averages about 3.5% nationwide. Well, they said, what if they got it down all the way down to 1.4%, which is going to be enormously hard. And even then, blue hydrogen is worse for the climate than just directly burning methane. So that's that. This is the second paper. It came out of Australian National University. I won't take you through it except to say that they came to very similar conclusions, that making hydrogen from fossil fuels produces substantial greenhouse gas emissions. And that was last November from Fiona Beck. This is another report. This is really from a financial analysis firm from Europe called Fitch Solutions, and they had some interesting aspects to highlight. The cost for blue hydrogen will prove prohibitively expensive. You end up, by pursuing this path, locking in a lot of infrastructure and assets that are carbon intensive. So you've got to build all these steam methane reformers and extra pipelines to carry the carbon dioxide to do the sequestration. All of the stuff that you shouldn't have to build, that is a stupid investment, and it's wrong versus just building solar and wind just to pursue this bunch of snake oil. And then they say it's also not possible to capture all the emissions, which it's not. And so we will now turn to what is actually happening to the atmosphere as a result of fracking and releasing all of these methane emissions into the atmosphere. And so this is a chart published by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And they measure the concentration of methane in the atmosphere. They have data going back to 1988. In 1988 was about 1,700 parts per billion. It has increased and increased with this very interesting shape, all the way to where it's now about 1,900 parts per billion. And because methane is such a powerful greenhouse gas, remember I said it's got a global warming potential 84 times greater than carbon dioxide, and that's over a 20-year time frame according to the IPCC. Because of all of that, methane amounts for a good 25% of all the global warming we're seeing on the planet today. That's according to the IPCC. And so why do we see this shape? So methane was increasing and increasing, and then it plateaued for a while. It was constant for about a decade, and then it went back up again. And that's about when the shale gas boom started in 2008. And there's stories and studies published saying why that is. And this one from National Geographic directly tied the US shale gas boom to this secondary increase in methane concentration. So the reason why we're seeing, as much global warming as we are is partially due to, fracking and the increased use of natural gas or methane for all of the reasons we're putting it to. And it just leaks throughout its entire value chain, and we just need to stop using it and keeping it in the ground if we want to have a safe climate for our future. Now I'm going to turn to what's going on in New Mexico in the legislature. So, there has been a series, we're now up to 4 attempts at the legislature to pass a hydrogen hub development act in the state. And what the the administration is trying to pursue is basically about $2 billion that is available in federal tax money for states that build what are called hydrogen hubs. So it's money that was put in the Infrastructure Act. The first attempt was House Bill 4, and that bill was tabled in the House Energy Natural Resources Committee January 29th. I said at that time it may return, and by golly, it did. It returned in House Bill 227, which we ended up defeating last week. And then it came back in Senate Bill 194, a different version of it from Senator Munoz, and we defeated that yesterday or the day before. It's all running together. And the latest version is House Bill 228, which is being heard tonight in House Commerce and Economic Development. And we hope our allies are showing up in force to defeat that. You know, we have had upwards of 200 people show up into these committee hearings on Zoom saying, don't do this. Impassioned testimony from members of frontline communities saying, you're killing us with this methane and this fracking, and please stop. And yet they continue to try because there's this $2 billion bribe out there. So the other thing that's in the legislature, in the budget, is if you're familiar with how the legislature works, there's House Bill 2, which contains the entire budget for this next year. And if you go look on page 216 of House Bill 2, there is a line item for $125 million for what's called the Hydrogen Hub Project Fund, which is triggered and enabled if we were to pass House Bill 4, which is now defunct, or similar legislation. And so they have now tried 3 new attempts at similar legislation. The latest one is tonight, so that they could, you know, detonate this hydrogen bomb, as I call it, this line item for money for, you know, basically private money or public money given to private institutions that don't need it, so that they can build hydrogen hubs in the state. This slide is intended to convey the fact that hydrogen leaks throughout its entire value chain. These are studies published by gasindex.org, some from the Natural Resources Defense Council. There are links down there. So methane leaks at the gas wells and the fracking fields. It leaks in the gas gathering pipelines and the compressor stations and all the valves that they use. It leaks in the gas pipe processing plant and all the transmission pipelines that ends up taking it to customers through your gas meters. And easily 0.8% of all the leakage occurs just in this distribution chain, another 2.6% from the gas fields. And I point this out because one of the arguments the administration is making is that, well, you know, we have spent a lot of time in the last year putting together these much more stringent methane rules that will, you know, impose some more restrictions on industry as they extract natural gas, and they're going to have to really crank down and, you know, stop their leaking and find the sources of these leaks, and then they're going to certify that it's not leaky. And my point with this slide is that they've got a hell of a long way to go. They have to get way below 1.4% leakage versus the 3.5% that they're at today, and there's just literally no way to do that. You know, these things leak, and you fix the leaks, and then they leak again the following week when you come back. So it would require an army of people going out and inspecting these hundreds of miles of pipelines and the thousands of fracking wells to find and fix all these leaks on a continuous basis. And there's just no way that's ever going to happen. Even if we were to hire those thousands of people, you could bet in the next fossil-friendly administration, they would fire them all again, because the oil industry does not want regulators out in the field making sure that they follow the rules. So what could they do instead, right? So I remember we said the price tag for converting the Escalante power plant was originally $425 million. So I did this little thought exercise saying, well, if you really wanted to solve a climate crisis and produce clean electricity at a profit and, you know, build something compliant with the Energy Transition Act, going off. You could build an equivalently powerful solar electricity power plant, 164 megawatts. You could also build a 4-hour massive battery farm to go with it to provide nearly firm power, which is, what they all harp about. It wouldn't cost you $425 million. It would only cost you $328 million. And versus that, you end up saving $97 million versus what you're planning to do. And you're going to produce electricity at a profit. And you could surely use $97 million to employ 110 people for quite some time. In fact, you could just directly pay them $88,000 a year for 10 years. And that's where your $97 million goes. So it is a foolish expenditure of money based on propping up the fossil fuel industry in their last throes. This is my math showing you how I came up with all those conclusions. Coming towards the end now. So as we said, hydrogen is a very inefficient energy carrier, and at least in transportation very specifically, which is a lot of the places where they want to convince us to use hydrogen, they're going to have to compete directly with electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are growing by leaps and bounds. In fact, EV sales growth around the world doubled last year, literally increased by 98% from the year before. It is exponential growth. And so we are seeing massive build out of charging infrastructure. In fact, according to the energy.gov website, there are now 44,000 public charging stations across the country. You know how many fueling stations there are for hydrogen? There are 48 of them. And they are all in California, and here's where they are. So a hydrogen transportation fueling infrastructure for road transport is going to have to build a nationwide fueling system for hydrogen that doesn't exist today. And there are no hydrogen pipelines, and they're going to have to do it knowing that they are years behind the lead the electric vehicles have in the marketplace for transportation. And they say, well, there's the long distance trucking industry where if you're going to drive your truck all the way across the country, that's where hydrogen will work best. And I say, no, you can actually stop your truck, a few times across country and just recharge those batteries and you're good to go. And by the way, it's a heck of a lot cheaper. So what do hydrogen fuel cell vehicles look like? Well, Toyota makes one. It's called the Mirai. It's a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. So it's a very sleek, high-end luxury car. If they sold it at the price it really took them to make it, it would be well over $100,000. They sold about 3,000 fuel cell vehicles in the country today between Toyota, Hyundai, and Honda, which are the three manufacturers. Compare that to the 600,000 electric vehicles that were sold in the country last year, and they are behind at a ratio of 200 to 1. So what we should be doing instead, and this is my last slide, what we should be doing instead, if we really want to solve the climate crisis, is we should be aggressively building 100% renewable energy on the grid, using that clean electricity to shut down the coal-fired and gas-fired power plants that are the major sources of climate emissions today, and using all that clean electricity to power electric vehicles and electrify decarbonized transportation, as well as heat pumps for our homes to replace our gas heaters and furnaces and water heaters in the home. Versus this challenge of doing what we need to do, we only have about 7% of clean electricity on the grid today versus what we need. We really need to get to 50% by 2030 to have a chance at staving off the worst effects of the climate crisis. And if we did that, if we got to 50% by 2030, we would actually have smooth sailing to get to 100% by 2036, because we would have built all the factory to produce it all, and we just keep them running and then you're done. That's another analysis that I did. So that's where we should be focusing our efforts, not being distracted, focusing on job 3, which is decarbonizing some sectors with hydrogen. So This is, reprise of my opening slide, just to give you the summary points. Blue hydrogen's a fossil fuel program. It's 20% worse than just burning natural gas directly. It's extremely inefficient as a energy carrier versus electricity. We should be building solar and wind instead. Electricity from hydrogen is just not profitable. And if we would pursue hydrogen production from methane in the state, as the Hydrogen Hub Act would have us do, we're going to be producing 2 kilograms of carbon dioxide for every unit of hydrogen that we produce, and it will increase New Mexico's carbon footprint. And we should not be using state tax dollars or in resources to push such a fallacious program. So that is it. I've got a bunch of backup slides that I'm not going to go through, but I want to show you this one. So this is the fallacy of carbon capture and sequestration. And the example is a Petronova carbon capture facility in Houston, Texas. It was a coal-fired power plant. They meaning the energy department, provided over $1 billion to retrofit a carbon capture facility, and that's what one of those looks like, to bolt onto this coal-fired power plant. And what they're intending to do is capture all of the carbon dioxide emissions that would have gone up these stacks. And here's the flue gas duct with all those CO2 emissions from the scrubbers. And then they're going to capture it and sequester it, right? But guess what? In order to power this carbon capture and sequestration facility, they had to build a whole other gas-fired power plant for cogeneration to power the CCS system, the carbon capture and sequestration. So no, they couldn't use the output of the coal electricity to run carbon capture. They have to build a natural gas power plant separately. And so this is an example, the example is that powering carbon capture really robs one of these electricity generating plants on average of about 25 to 30% of the load that they would have otherwise sent to the grid. So it's enormously expensive. It's inefficient. It really just does not work. And this power plant was shut down in 2020 because it was a failure. And by the way, they missed their carbon capture targets by a full 17%. So I guess at that, I will stop my ranting at you and close it out today, and we'll open it up for questions. Thank you. Pat, you're on mute, but I'd love to hear your question.
Thanks. Thank you, Tom. That was really informative. So right now we have 5 questions in the chat.
Okay.
And we said we go to about 7:30 with the questions. So okay. I'm going to go with the one from Melinda first. Have you or anyone had a chance to present this information to the governor's team and or legislative leaders? And if so, what was their reaction?
I have presented this presentation over multiple iterations to now 23 different legislators have heard it. And it started with Senator Stewart, Pro Tem Stewart, who really encouraged me to put this together, and then got some of her senators to hear it, and then the word kind of spread. And I have invited all members of that caucus to hear this multiple times. I've literally at least 6 times to that caucus, and I've gotten it before 23 of them. The governor is not interested in hearing this presentation. I've offered it to Secretary Kinney, but yes, that's what I've done. And it's made an impact. It has absolutely made an impact. And I think there is pretty solid opposition in a core of that caucus opposing this. And that's, you've seen that as the first 3 attempts to pass a hydrogen hub bill have gone down in flames, so to speak, kind of like the Hindenburg. Good
All
question.
right. Well, we have several questions from Paul. So regarding the Escalante hydrogen plant, Biotech claims to have a method that releases less greenhouse gases than the conventional methods of separating hydrogen from natural gas. If so, does it really have much of an impact on the overall greenhouse gas release from blue hydrogen?
Well, remember the slide that I showed you from all about Biotech, and the information that I was presenting there was directly from their own website. And so their own website says that for every kilogram of hydrogen they produce, they release into the atmosphere 9 kilograms of carbon dioxide. And that is the very dirtiest kind of gray hydrogen. They claim that it's a little better than others, but their own website lists the emissions that they produce. They used to have a section on their website, which I looked at, and it's been a few weeks since I went back and visited, on their sustainability section. And they had a little link that talked about carbon capture and sequestration. And, you know, there was some option for carbon capture. It has since been removed because I don't think it was very viable. And so what they are doing is selling these hydrogen hubs to customers with no provisions to capture the CO2 that comes off. It's just vented into the atmosphere. If a customer wants to attempt to do CCS with one of these mobile hydrogen hubs, they have to do that themselves. They have to figure that all out and invent and bolt on some carbon capture equipment, and then find a way to pipe it somewhere where it can be sequestered. And that's, yeah.
Pat, could I get an elaboration on that? Could I
Go ahead. Go ahead, Paul. Yeah.
Okay. I got that information based on something on their website, which showed that their technique had a footprint of 90 something, I don't know what the units are, but let's say 90, as compared to the standard technique, which had 160. So that's where I got that. But I also, and part of that's kind of implicit in my question, is that even if that were true, and it probably is not, but if that were true, would that really make enough of a difference to matter? Because I'm thinking of the Jacobson, no, the Cornell and Jacobson studies.
Howarth and Jacobson, yeah.
Yeah,
They're both
that seem to indicate that if you adjust that level somewhat, it still doesn't make an overall difference because of all the related releases.
Yes, you are absolutely right, Paul. So all of the emissions that Biotech is talking about are at the point of hydrogen production. They are not talking about a full life cycle analysis. They make no accounting for all of the upstream methane leakage that is embodied in the methane that is their feed gas into steam methane reforming. So all they're talking about is the CO2 directly emitting at the site of their hydrogen hub.
Yeah, okay. Well, the reason I asked the question, of course, is because I think that's our politicos are putting a lot of their thinking on Biotech and helping them out.
Yeah.
And I've never seen a sense of it, and I think you've confirmed that. It doesn't compute.
Nope.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks.
All
I
right.
have more questions, but I want to give somebody else a chance.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
Well, they're all from you, Paul. So we'll keep going.
Okay.
I'll look for others. Will green hydrogen soon make blue hydrogen facilities obsolete?
Yeah. So good question. And the answer, so the answer is probably yes. There have been multiple economic studies from Bloomberg and S&P Global, et cetera, looking at the forecast for the cost of hydrogen over the next now 8 years, through 2030. And so here's what will happen. The cost of green electricity gets cheaper and cheaper over time as we just make cheaper and cheaper solar panels and larger wind turbines, and the unit cost of electricity just goes down and down and down. So the price of clean electricity to power those electrolyzers goes down. And then the other major cost is how much does it cost to build, one of these electrolysis systems. And that is something where you just, the learning curve for manufacturing things in volume, just like we've seen with solar panels and cell phones and computers. As you make millions and millions of the same thing, you get better and better, and you pull costs out, and they get cheaper and cheaper over time. And that is forecasted to happen with hydrogen electrolyzers, and people have put those charts together and forecasted that the cost of green electricity from electrolysis of water by 2030 will be cheaper than producing hydrogen from methane, because there are no similar cost learning curve opportunities in producing gray hydrogen. Gray hydrogen has been used in the ammonia industry and petrochemical manufacturing for decades now, for maybe 100 years. And it is a very mature technology, and they've wrung, most of the costs out of that. So the cost of producing blue hydrogen is going to be pretty stable, and the cost of green hydrogen is going to get cheaper and cheaper. And those curves will intersect, according to many, many financial forecasts from very credible analysts, by about 2030. So it's a good question, because for a couple of reasons. One is, if you're going to be a company investing in producing blue hydrogen, you're going to have to build all of this stuff that ends up being stranded assets by the end of this decade, right? All the steam methane reformers, all of the carbon capture and sequestration equipment, all of the air separation units. None of that stuff carries over into producing green hydrogen. It is all wasted investment, because you don't use any of that for electrolysis. What you use for electrolysis is electrolyzers, which is basically a series of parallel plates, a cathode and an anode in a big stack. And they're pretty cheap to build, and they're getting better at it, and they're getting cheaper and cheaper. And so you end up investing in a bunch of stuff that's wasted, that will be disused, and will just be, a financial anchor around any company that ties their future to that kind of a technology. And those companies are going to go out of business, faced with the competition from green hydrogen in a decade. And so, people ask, what are the fundamental reasons why, there's this $2 billion in federal tax money. Why shouldn't we just grab it and invest it and use it for New Mexico and build all these companies? And I say, you're going to be building a bunch of companies that are going to go bankrupt in 8 years. And I would rather see all of those bankruptcies and business failures occur in some other state, not in New Mexico, where we've got, the solutions to the climate crisis literally outside, enormous amount of sun, one of the sunniest states in the country and one of the windiest states in the country. And we should be taking advantage of the resources that we've got, not going down this false path, no matter how big the bribe is. Good question.
That sounds right to me, and I don't understand why that doesn't resonate a little bit more with our politicos here, including Heinrich, by the way.
I know. I haven't had a chance to get with Heinrich, and we've been trying.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask one more from Paul, and then I have a question.
Okay.
So could the hydrogen hub provisions in the Build Back Better bill be applied to green energy solutions?
Good question. So if you look, and I do have a backup slide on this, if you look at the provisions in the, it's actually not in the Build Back Better, it's in the infrastructure bill that was passed and signed into law. There are 3, and I'll just show you. I'll tell you what, I've got a slide, I might as well use it. So here it is. So this is straight out of the, what was called the BIF, the Bipartisan Infrastructure bill. This is what's in there. There's $8 billion to support the development of at least 4 clean hydrogen hubs across the United States, right? At least one hub to produce hydrogen from fossil fuels, one hub for hydrogen produced from renewable energy, and another from nuclear, and then a fourth one that would be another one of the first three. So yes, we could be going after a hydrogen hub from renewable energy, but we're not. And that's the money that was put into the infrastructure bill, which is now law.
Okay, that sounds right to me. I agree with everything you say, Tom.
Thanks, Bo.
All right, my question is less technical and more big picture. So we have a goal of reducing emissions by 50% by 2030 to stave off reaching a critical level of greenhouse gas. But I know New Mexico is a big fossil fuel producer. We're a big geographic area and we're a small population, and we're surrounded by, other states with bigger populations. So my question is, having New Mexico meet that goal, and if other states don't have similar goals, what is the impact of us reaching that, possibly exceeding it by that target date of 2030?
Good question. It's a little complicated. So let's start by understanding what are the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And so about half of it, well, about a quarter of it is from generating electricity. Another quarter of it comes from transportation, burning gasoline or diesel fuel in our vehicles. And the rest of it is a mix of emissions from industry and from buildings. So most of it from buildings is, our furnaces and our hot water heaters that burn methane. And then there's industry, and there's cement manufacturing, and there's steel manufacturing, and all of that stuff. So what has to happen is, first you got to decarbonize the electric grid, and that is to produce all of this wind and solar so that we can stop burning things like coal and natural gas to produce electricity. That takes care of about a quarter of all the emissions. New Mexico has signed up to pursue that as our state policy in the Energy Transition Act. Many, many other states have similar bills to the Energy Transition Act, not all of them. Colorado has one. Texas does not. Arizona does not, although they have a weaker standard. And those renewable portfolio standards are spreading around the country. And the big promise of making a major step towards fixing the climate crisis was to pass the Build Back Better plan, which originally had a national clean energy standard that would have basically made federal law very similar to what the New Mexico Energy Transition Act, to say that all of the electricity generation in all the states in the country had to follow a similar path and get to 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. That bill is stalled behind every single Republican and 2 Democrats in the Senate. And we hope that it will be revived and passed in the March timeframe in some fashion that will basically, either through regulations or sticks or carrots, provide the incentives to convert the electric grid. So that gets us to a national program where we actually would pursue all of those things and not just have this patchwork of individual states trying to go as fast as we can, and other states with less progressive governments lagging behind and still burning fossil fuels. So that's the first thing. The rest of the world has to follow along with us, right? Because global, carbon pollution doesn't care where it's coming from, whether it's China or India or France or, or the United States or Australia. You got to solve it all. And so that chart that I showed you with this, at the very end, with this ramp of clean energy going up to 100%, a similar program has to be pursued around the world. And there are other countries around the world that are ahead of us in that, very specifically the European Union, which, doesn't have, is less captured by the oil and gas industry than the American government is. And they are very aggressively implementing very strong, emissions controls and building, especially wind, especially offshore wind off of Europe. Tremendous progress in building giant wind turbines offshore. And so they're making good progress. China is actually making tremendous progress as well. They built more offshore wind. Here's a fact for you. China built more offshore wind last year than the rest of the world has in the previous 5 years combined. So one of the challenges you always hear from, the opponents of this is, well, what about China? Why should the United States be in the lead on this clean energy transition and, hobble our industry, our economy with this very expensive renewable energy, which, by the way, is the cheapest electricity you could build, no longer expensive. What about China? We have to wait for them because, they're not doing the right thing. Well, they are pursuing decarbonization as fast as they can. Unfortunately, they built a whole boatload of coal-fired power plants in the meantime, and they are choking on that pollution. So politically, economically, and for their own reasons, they are trying to convert away from the coal that they invested in, and that's their challenge. They are factually the #1 CO2 emitter in the world today. The United States is #2. If you add up all of the historical emissions from all countries in the world, we are still #1 because China's emissions are much more recent. But so that's the complicated argument that you get into, but that's the path forward. We have to decarbonize the grid. We have to do it in the United States. We have to take some leadership so we can, drag the rest of the world with us. We have and could build a tremendous amount of manufacturing capacity to build solar panels and wind turbines, and we are doing some of that. We just need to build a lot more of it. If we were to pass a national version of this Build Back Better Act that said, all of the states are going to have to do this, that would just supercharge our ability to build all of this stuff as fast as we need to. And that's step one. And then you electrify everything. And as I said, the progress towards electrifying transportation is growing by leaps and bounds, faster in other countries around the world than it is in the United States, but still pretty fast here. And automobile manufacturers in this country and around the world are being pushed, quite frankly, by Tesla, which is stealing their high-end market share. And they are they're going to go out of business if they don't convert to electric vehicles real fast. And so they're, lots and lots of companies are saying they're not going to make gasoline engines, in another 5, 10, 15 years, and it's all going to be electric. And that's another part of the solution. I could go on, but maybe that's enough of an answer for you.
We need the Build Back Better plan.
We absolutely need that. And by the way, we need some election reforms in the meantime so that we still have a democracy to implement it. But yes.
Yeah. Okay. Mandy has her hand up. Mandy, you got to unmute. Unmute, Mandy.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Go ahead, Mandy.
What committee is it in right now, and when will it be heard tomorrow night?
It was due to be heard right as I was coming on in House Commerce and Economic Development Committee.
So it's too late to call.
They may well be hearing it because the first time House Bill 4 got heard in committee, it lasted for 6 hours. So you could try.
So we should go ahead and call tomorrow.
Yeah, watch the news and see if it passed. But yeah, so, that's the first committee. And in order to pass a bill and get it to the governor's desk, it has to go through, House committees and then a full House floor vote. And then it has to go over to a Senate, get through the Senate committees and get a Senate vote. And so even if we lose in the first House committee, there's still lots of chances to kill this bill. And now the last, what do we got, 8 days left in the session. And there is very stiff opposition in the Senate to this prospect. So, yeah, I think we got a good chance of.
Laura says it's still being heard tonight.
Okay.
All right, Lisa.
Yes, Tom, there are a lot of us who are very concerned about this issue, but we're not experts in the field. Obviously, all of us can't be. What can we best do to be in touch with our electeds? And do we just say, follow the science? What do we do to jump on board in as strong a way as we can?
Yes, the best thing to do is to contact your legislators directly. And I'm sure you are well practiced in doing that.
Yeah.
We have on our website, 350newmexico.org, and I put into the chat when I started, a link to the climate bills that we follow. This is at the top of the list. We update the status of that chart on our webpage every night with where these bills are and where they're going to be heard next, with links to the committees and links to the contact information. So if you want to, I mean, that's the best information that we know how to provide for how to advocate against it. When we have a fact sheet, we link to the fact sheet on that webpage, so you're, armed with some talking points. So that's a good place to start. And yeah, we got 9 more days till the 17th next week to try to kill this one. We also would very dearly like to pass the one or the couple of really positive climate bills. House Bill 6, the Clean Future Act, which unfortunately I think is tangled up in this controversy, sadly. But still have hope that we could pass that. But yes, contact your legislators, call them up, call their office phone, leave a message.
No, I'm on a Zoom.
And you don't need to be well practiced in the reasons why. Just say we oppose development of hydrogen in this state. It's going to increase our carbon footprint. I care about a safe climate, and that's probably all you'd need to know. And they'll put a tally mark on their sheet and mark you down as opposing. Legislators respond when they hear from their constituents. They absolutely do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more questions.
Okay.
I'm going to stop the recording then at this point, unless you want to do anything else to close it, Tom.
I think we've had a good session, and again, we know what the solutions are to the climate crisis. They are being enthusiastically opposed by the fossil fuel industry through all of the millions and billions that they have to spend, because they are looking at a future where we will no longer purchase their products. And that means that, all of the fossil fuel reserves that prop up their stock prices, the oil in the ground and the methane in the ground, ends up getting valued eventually at zero. And then their companies go away, and, all of the millions that they've been making go away, and they don't like that future. And that's what we're fighting against. But we know how to solve this problem. We convert to 100% renewable energy. There is a place for some amount of hydrogen in the next decade to solve some of the other hard to decarbonize sectors. Most importantly, probably steel manufacturing. But that time is not now. We have to solve and decarbonize the electric grid first. And they are trying to distract us from that with this hydrogen hype. And we just need to fight against it, and we are. Every single environmental organization that I know of in the state, like well over 20 of them, are opposed to this initiative, and we are standing firm, shoulder to shoulder, opposing this, despite the best efforts to peel off one or more of us, and it's not working.
Great, thank you for that summary. I'm going to stop the recording.